We weren't told what the protest was about. We weren't given context. So the only bits of information we were getting were from people outside who were in the room. Like, Milos was texting us like this and this is happening and stuff like that. It was a very bizarre experience. And then the question was, does the CA team wait for the situation to be resolved, or do they have a backroom final? And they decided to have a backroom final, which then happened in a boiler room somewhere in the depths of that convention center.
So little birdie told me that you took some inspiration from Gordon Ramsey. If I have heard correctly, can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so that's one of the sources of inspiration. But I think with Gordon Ramsay in particular, it's just about.
I have to ask the spicier question. So, out of these teams, who do you think would win, and why is it me and Roman? So yeah, Dean, welcome to the show. I'm very, very happy that you agreed to do this with us. I'm sure that many people would love to watch this episode. I'm not gonna introduce you too much. You are a world champion. In this show, we don't give CVs for world champions. I guess the other thing that I can say is that you were also the best speaker in the world, one of the best speakers in the world still. So I'm sure that you're gonna have interesting things to talk about. Before everything else, how do you feel?
I feel fine. I'm very happy that you invited me to talk on this podcast. I've watched some of the previous episodes, and I think it's really interesting to have a lot of people talk about like very specific debate stuff. And I'm really excited to hearing what you have to ask me here.
I'm sure you're gonna appreciate and some of the upcoming episodes as well. So let's get this straight out of the gate. One of our future guests will mention something called the teen tax. Are you aware of it? What is it? How do you feel about it?
I have to admit, I am very unaware of what that is.
Okay, so the teen tax is apparently something that Rumen, Matt Cato, and a bunch of other debaters came up with when they found themselves in numerous situations where in around three of a lot of competitions they would get you in the room and you would beat their ass in the debate and then it would continue, and after maybe the 10th time of this happening they just started calling it the tin tax. You do well the first two rounds, then you pay the tin tax and you continue with the competition.
Oh, yeah. Well, I remember Roman complaining about us hitting each other in round three very often. But to be fair, Roman and Matt Cato have got back at me in quite a few semifinals and finance motions, so I think we can call it even.
Fair enough, fair enough. I think this is an interesting segue to ask you about something that you have a particular perspective on, I think. In debating, and you're one of those examples, there are many examples of people that are gain particular codes of personality, I would say, and people follow them, they follow their speeches. Of course, there is nothing wrong with that per se, but what is your opinion in codes of personalities in debating, and is it something that can be problematic at certain points?
I mean, I guess it depends on how you define cults of personality. I mean, I think, of course, in any area of life, it becomes a problem at the point where you uncritically idolize a person, and that can also create an issue with accountability in a bunch of areas. But like, I think in debating, it's mostly innocuous. I think it's similar to when you watch a sport, like you have your favorite sports person who you really admire and look up to. And I've had people like that, like throughout my debating career, and I suppose that's gonna come up when it comes down to the go-to discussion. But I think it's not harmful as long as it's reasonable. And I think if one does find themselves to be in a position where they are the one being, followed or idolized, I remember David talking about his fan page and stuff like that. I think, using that position to create some kind of positive change in the community, like not just be the far away distant person who people, admire from a distance, but like if people invite you to, give a workshop, you can give a workshop, or if people ask you for advice, you should give advice. You should be, approachable to people, because like not only does that make them happy in the sense of like interpersonal interaction, but I think if one has a lot of experience in debating and they have gone through a bunch of tournaments and a bunch of other stuff, I think it's just a very nice thing to do, to try to share that knowledge with others. And I think for people in a position who are getting approached by a lot of people for that, they should be using that in order to, facilitate the development of other people in debating, but also their enjoyment in the activity overall.
Yeah, I want to expand a little bit on that question. I think a funny way that I've kind of talked about this, and I think that it was even a motion created similar to this, which is basically the thin versus chin motion. As many people know, after Chin won worlds and was the best speaker, he did disappear from debating. Well, not entirely. I'm sure that he was at some places, but he was definitely to this day not very active. And I guess the opposite of that would be you, where you did many of the things that you just mentioned, which is being more active in the community. Do you think that once you get to that point, there is a certain duty that you have to the community, or is it absolutely based on personal preference?
I mean, I think it comes down to this. I think it's perfectly fine to decide to quit the community at one point. Like, we have different phases in life, and if it's something that's not fulfilling for anyone anymore, it's just stressful. I know a bunch of people who began feeling that way about debating. It's perfectly fine to leave. But I think if you do stay, then apart from just doing debating for your own enjoyment, if you are already there and already present at these tournaments and already giving up your time, then I think it's fair to say that part of that time should be given and devoted to helping out the community. But I think the question of duty kind of becomes redundant for me, for a lot of people who do stay in debating, because I think most of us have gone through the experience of either having someone who helped us develop when we were younger, either be directly like as a coach or a person whose workshops we watch or debates we watch, and we're grateful for that, and therefore it's natural to want to replicate that. Or it's the opposite, where you didn't have that, and then you had to struggle with learning things on your own, and getting your ass beaten in bin rooms time after time after time. And then because you didn't have that, it feels natural to want to provide it to someone else. So I think the duty question, at least I would hope, for a lot of people becomes an irrelevant one, because it's just a natural feeling to want to do that.
Yeah, I think this is also connected to an interesting question that I've always were very curious about, especially with accomplished speakers. So a lot of accomplished speakers do go to judging, and after they accomplish their career, they start judging. And this is, I mean, of course, you can judge, wow, you are trying to become a better debater, but after you've done what you wanted to do, you also see this as a other potential way to prove your skills, I guess, if I can say it like that. So what do you think about judging versus speaking? Do you prefer one over the other? Is it something that everyone should do, every speaker should be doing, or it's dependent on the person?
Well, so I think in terms of my personal preference, I really strongly prefer speaking, because I just find judging to be incredibly tiring without the added adrenaline, right? Because when you speak, I think it's more of energy spikes. You have to be focused during prep. Then you kind of disconnect during some speeches to some extent, or disconnect after your speech. You listen more to the speech before you, but it's more like spikes of energy. And then there's the adrenaline rush when you yourself are speaking. When you're judging, there's no adrenaline associated at all, because you're not competing. You're not like on the spot having to think of arguments, but you have to be focused like 10 times more, because first there's 8 speeches you need to listen to, like, in a very focused way. Then there's D-Lib. Then if you're chairing, there's away. And then there's feedback, and then rinse and repeat. And I think it just becomes really emotionally and mentally tiring after a couple of rounds. So I'm not a fan particularly. I don't find judging to be too interesting. I do, however, think it's very useful for debaters to judge at least once in a while, because I think the primary skill you learn is learning to assess how judges are likely to assess your arguments, right? Because you get this inside view into a D-Lib that's like 15 or 20 minutes long, and where judges do have to make some trade-offs in terms of to what extent they discuss some themes and some themes they don't, or some arguments and some arguments they don't. And then you kind of can assume, or at least have a sense of how you should prepare your case, how you should emphasize certain things or strategize differently based on how you think judges perceive teams in a room. And I think it's not just down to listening to arguments, it's also about psychology, right? This is why I always tell my kids, for example, never go into a room and say something like, oh, I'm so grateful to be in this top room, or never sound unconfident when you're delivering an argument, even if you think you know jack shit about the topic. Because the subconscious psychology of many judges, and I've seen this with many wings, is if a team is unconfident, it's very easy to give them the fourth, because they think they're fourth, right? So they won't give bad feedback, but you will kind of subconsciously discuss the team that's like more arrogant and confident, in the room to a larger extent, if nothing else, because you want to make sure that the feedback you give them is comprehensive enough to convince them that they're actually wrong. And I think this is not something that people do consciously, but it's a very natural subconscious reaction judges have, and just a very good example of the things you notice when you judge and then can adapt accordingly when you are speaking. But like, judging is not particularly enjoyable for me. The reason why I continue to do it, I will admit honestly, is partly due to frustration at having been in a situation where, as per what CA teams have very openly told me and told others, I was supposed to chair more than one open grand final of a major, and I got clashed out every single time for various reasons, to the point where it's already becoming like a comedy show. So I'm like, before I retire, I will judge that one open final, like, even if it's like 69 years old, I will get that final, because it's already becoming, frustrating. But speaking is definitely the more enjoyable activity for me.
Yeah, I also agree. I think before doing Euros and then Worlds, I did judge at Belgrade WDC, and it did help me a lot, kind of being part of panels in the out rounds, but also chairing in the rounds. It was definitely a very useful experience for me as a speaker to kind of view the other sides of the debate. I think generally you have to experience both sides regardless of what you want to be better at as particular skills, because it is very connected to, if you want to be a good speaker, you need to understand how judges think and what happens in a deliberation room. I think even if you want to be a good judge, or for example give better OAs, you have to have had a few debates where you listen to OAs and you think about what would I have liked to hear here in this particular position. Um, does this particular perspective change when we talk about CA in competitions? Do you
What do you
particularly
what do you
enjoy
mean by
it?
this question?
Or do you still not like going to judge competitions if you're a CA, or does that kind of change your perspective? Do you prefer it than just, let's say, being a judge at a competition?
I think CAing is a lot more fun, because there's a lot more, dynamism involved and fluidity involved in that, in the sense of like, you get to prep motions for people and then see how people do. There's also the, at least for me, very fun part of getting to be, backstage with tab stocking and like looking at all the statistics and how motions panned out and what speakers people got, and looking at ballots, like, seeing all the results come in, doing like stats and all of that kind of stuff. I really like it and enjoy that. And there's also the fact that as a CA, I think you get a lot more leeway when it comes to outrounds, because you're not expected to allocate yourself for outrounds, because of course you want to give the position to someone who meritocratically earned it through the judge break, and you want to give this to as many people as possible, right? And then not only are you doing something good for other people by allocating them, but also you get more free time, like during outrounds, for example, as opposed to like for at Madrid, like day 2 of outrounds, I judged every single outround and I was exhausted by the end of that day. I think the difference for me would be CAing a major, because I did DCA Astana Euros, and that was an incredibly exhausting experience. I think it was partially because of the fact that it was the first online major, at least as far as I know, and then a lot of adaptation had to be done there. Like, to get there were not that many, how do you say, mechanisms which were in place that were like routine at the time, and we had to adapt a lot. But it's also just, spending the week before Euros, like every day 6 hours on like a motion meeting and stuff like this. That's just something I didn't really enjoy, because it was beyond the level of work I wanted to put in to still be able to enjoy the tournament. And after that, I did get some more offers for majors, but I don't think I want to see a major anymore. But when it comes to like tournaments, like, Sofia or Belgrade or Zagreb and stuff like this, that's something I really, really enjoy doing more than judging.
Yeah, definitely it's different. Astana Euros was my first major ever, so I do remember that back at that point, uh, people were still figuring out stuff, but I think it went pretty well, especially um, I guess from a debate point of view. So it's interesting to see how we've evolved, and I definitely think that it is different when we talk about seeing online competitions and seeing in-person competitions, because obviously I think having to actually interact with your team, be it the CA team or whatever, is much better and much more enjoyable, because you get to kind of like have these conversations between stuff happening, maybe have a cigarette if you're Balkan or something like that. But it's a bonding experience, being in a team, being together. I think that's an underrated uh, plus of having to getting the opportunity to see a competition. While we're on the topic of judging, do you think that there are any bad trends in judging currently that you wouldn't like to see more of?
So I think, like, maybe this is a controversial opinion, I don't know, but I think judging is actually improving for the better, at least in my opinion. I know that some people are not a fan of judging at some points being an exercise of, tracking very fast speakers and writing down all of their five mechanisms and stuff like that. And they agree that the debating definitely needs to also be a, stylistic game, a theatrical game, if you want. But I think in terms of judging, the trend towards judges being more attentive and focused on writing things and having very detailed notes, which I think has appeared alongside the trend of, faster, more mechanistic speakers, is a good thing, because we get judges who, if not necessarily listen, then at least have something to remind them of what speakers have actually said. And I think this reduces issues like, um, anti-ESL bias or any other form of bias that might exist when judging. I think there are also particular, I wouldn't call them trends, but issues with circuit bias with certain judges, regardless of circuit. But I don't think that's necessarily a trend. I think it's just something that had always existed, like certain circuits favoring certain types of speeches more, speakers from their circuit more for various reasons. But I think the trends in judging are actually positive as opposed to negative, if you ask me.
I see. Well, this is interesting that you say this, because obviously some people would definitely disagree. I think there are some judges and speakers out there who believe that, um, of course, you need to be attentive to what's happening in the round, but after a certain point, it's not reasonable to expect every judge to write every single word that you're saying, and it's not a particularly good style of trying to kind of think of people. And I think the interesting part here is, I've had this conversation with Harish actually, when he was like, "Oh yeah, for example, this round X of worlds, I enjoyed much more your style. But in that particular round of worlds, he gave me the second against Naomi, speaking particularly fast, more than the average, I would say, because of particular things that he held up. So I think what I'm trying to say here is, while some people, including me to a certain extent, feel like it's not going in the best direction possible. There needs to be some balance between uh, speakers saying a bunch of stuff and judges being able to write them, and kind of rewarding speakers for saying more and more stuff. But it is also the question of, there are very successful speakers that can figure out that it's a good strategy to um, say more and more stuff in order to kind of as you yourself have called it in conversations we had, uh, multiple paths to victory. And it has become a viable strategy in debating that multiple successful speakers, many of them best speakers in the world, such as yourself, Matt Kaito, I think Naomi was second that particular year, but yeah, obviously very successful speakers. So, um, do you think that there is a cutoff point where it will become um, inequitable if if it becomes too much of expectations to kind of people to speak fast, and people to not only speak fast but say many things in a speech, or do you think it's kind of naturally going to um, balance itself out?
I think there's a natural limit because, like, I think people kind of oversimplify the issue of speaking fast, and they're like, speakers just speak fast and say a bunch of stuff and then win. I think there's a lot more to it than that, and there's a lot of skill behind that, right? Because first of all, if I speak too fast, no human being can understand me, and as you say yourself, it's not reasonable to expect of a judge to understand what I'm saying if there's like literally no breathing pauses in my speech. But secondly, if I try to say too many things and I underanalyze them, I might have four arguments which are potential paths to victory. But if they're not proven, that provides a lot of space for closing. And I mean, big shout out to Matt Cato. I respect him a lot. But I've always liked extending on him and Ahmed exactly because of that reason. Because there's a bunch of stuff set in there, but very often a bunch of missing links or gaps that they could very easily fill. And I did not find it as easy with certain other debaters who have different styles. So I think if someone overdoes it and just tries to say too many things or tries to say them too fast, they're not going to do particularly well in a debate. But I also think in terms of inequitability, it's kind of a double-sided coin, because you can say that it's inequitable that, some speakers have the ability to speak faster, but then it's also kind of inequitable that some speakers just happen to be born in Iona or North America, and by virtue of English being their native language, they just have a wider and more diverse vocabulary and better word economy and can be more persuasive. If you ask me, I think the trend of faster, more mechanistic speakers originated in the ESL community as opposed to the native community, if I look at speakers who began to do it first, because it was an equalizing tool. Like, if you can't beat them in style and rhetoric and persuasion and emotion, you can beat them with the knowledge smackdown. Just say more smart things and you'll win the debate. And I'm not necessarily a big opponent of that trend, because I think there is a natural cutoff point at which it simply becomes untenable for you to do that. I think, secondly, I appreciate the skill of individuals who can both say a lot of things and explain them well. But I also think, thirdly, to the extent to which it's interwoven with judging, I completely agree that we can't expect judges to be, robots. But I think the very fact that judging has become tracking heavy is an equalizing tool in debating, especially for ESL speakers, but also makes debating as fair as we can make it. Because of course, calls are arbitrary and subjective and stuff, but the more information you base them off of, the fairer they're going to be, if there is a metric of fairness at all in debating.
So which are some speakers that you kind of maybe modeled your style on, or you took some inspiration, or just were kind of very important to you while you were developing yourself as a speaker?
So for me, I always really appreciated mechanism heavy speakers. So I really liked Milos for that reason, even though he was never, a particularly fast speaker, but his speeches were always packed with a bunch of content, packed with a bunch of mechanisms. I think Helena Ivanov is also very good at doing those things, like very, very dense speeches with a lot of matter condensed in them. So those are some of the speakers that I think, I wouldn't say my style necessarily remembers, because I think with the way the debating meta has changed, necessarily to make my speeches be, let's say, maybe faster or more technical than theirs were. But that was kind of something I was aspiring to be, like a speaker that can pack a bunch of things in a speech, close off what the opposition can do, but also be able to explain it really well, just being a very, very good content deliverer, which I think is my primary strength.
Speaking of content, in order to do well with content, you need to kind of be versatile, especially with obviously the help of your teammate. But what are some type of motions that you struggled with, and how did you? This is a question that many of our audience ask. How did you kind of overcome that? Because I'm sure that as any speaker out there with some motions, you are much better than the others.
Yeah, so I've always struggled with econ, especially finance and banking. So I can kind of get the hang of macroeconomics, but when it comes to finance, I'm absolutely lost. I think in terms of being able to handle those motions, I think with every topic, there's a relatively easy way for you to, get the basic principles and basic arguments, because there's a bunch of workshops where people really lay it out for you, both in terms of debating workshops or just very short informative videos on YouTube and stuff like that. But I also think through experiencing debating those motions and perhaps getting your ass kicked in them, you just hear a bunch of speakers do good arguments. And when you hear an argument done like 4 or 5 times, maybe with slightly different mechanisms or twists to it, depending on the motion, but you hear the argument multiple times, you kind of get at least a level of baseline knowledge that allows you to be able to run a case in every debate. But I think there are limitations. I think nobody can be perfect in any topic. And I don't think I'll ever be as good as, I don't know, Stefan Sirijansky or as Lovro or as, I don't know, Naomi on finance. Like, that's just never going to happen. But that's a reason why there's a team in debating. And I think a very, very important consideration when pairing teams, whether you're doing this like on your own or you have trials, is what are the content strengths of those speakers. So having Lovro, who is good at econ, but also stuff like housing, urban development, was what made us a very strong team, because he covered for me where I had those weaknesses, and I would cover for him in religion or philosophy and all of those kinds of areas. And that's why, for example, when I was setting up Zagreb trials, one of our questions in the forum was, what are your strengths and weaknesses, both in terms of debating and content? Because I think if you have two speakers who are very good at econ, but very shit at anything fluffy, they will always be an unbalanced team. Like, they can get to some level of knowledge in the fluffy stuff, or the econ stuff, doesn't matter, but there's always going to be a limitation. So you need to have versatility within your team. Because for me, a lot of the stuff I know about econ today and the stuff I run today is stuff I learned from Lovro in situations where I was like, I don't understand this motion. I will ask you questions. I will lead the prep, and you feed me the content. And that's how I learn those things. But if I didn't have that partner, even the stuff I do know today and stuff I get away with, I wouldn't know. But I think it's important to recognize also your weaknesses when it comes to content, right? Because I think people sometimes think they have to excel at all forms of content, and then they try to research 10 things at once, and they never do a very good job of researching anything because they just, go too broad. I think it's fine to say there's some types of motions where I'm okay with taking a second and a pair of 80s and forgetting it happened, right? I think it's important to recognize your weaknesses as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of the very good teams out there. We already had like Darren Tamarov, for example, on the podcast. They are, I think, an example of like two very different people with kind of different skills in terms of knowledge gaps, and it kind of works really well. But I think it also kind of creates, you know, difference of personalities, because if you do have kind of like these different perspectives on different motions, and you know much more about this as compared to that, sometimes this also means that the two people are quite different as individuals, as how they handle things. Have you experienced that? And do you think there are some ways? I think so. From my perspective, I would say I think in the end it helps a lot going through that, but I think at first there might be some problems with how you communicate, if that makes sense, because certain things are more intuitive than others to different people.
Yeah, I've definitely experienced that. I mean, I'll have to reference Lovro again, obviously, because like my most long-term and most successful team I've been in, like, we're completely different in so many things. Like, I think first of all, psychologically, he's just a lot more chill than me and a lot more level-headed than me, whereas I'm the guy who's going to be stressing, backstabbing, panicking, stuff like that. It also translates to style of speaking. Like, whereas I'm more aggressive, more fast, he's the, down to earth guy who's gonna explain stuff to you like you're talking over a beer in a bar and all of those kinds of things. But I think this diversity helped us a lot, right? Because we had different skills. I agree that communication can perhaps be an issue, but I think in any team, regardless of whether your partner is similar to you as a person or not, there needs to be a lot of outside of tournament communication about how you are doing as a team, and just communicating to your partner how you understand prep, how you want prep to be run, how you want to communicate in between rounds. Like, do you want to discuss the round now? Do you want to have a debrief later? Just, I think communicating needs between partners. And if it's a healthy team, I think there's not going to be a barrier to, you agreeing to some kind of dynamic that suits both both partners. And if you can't agree to that kind of dynamic, then even if the two speakers are objectively very good, maybe the best in the institution, even if they have complementary debate skills, then this should probably not be a team. Because if a team cannot work as a healthy unit, it's likely going to crumble under the pressure when it comes to important bubble rooms or out rounds and stuff like that.
Speaking of pressure, you kind of alluded to this with this point. Um, how do you yourself handle pressure? Have you had certain moments of like, I mean, obviously at the beginning it happens, but I'm more interested in the pressure that comes with achieving some success and then having some types of expectations upon yourself or others having them. How did you handle that?
Well, I think it's firstly very important to have a good support structure, like people who you can talk to, who you can share your worries with when you're worrying that maybe you've been doing well previously, but now you're doing worse, and people are going to think worse of you, or you're worrying that you're not fulfilling your own expectations or other people's expectations. Very often these things are not rational, and very often these emotions don't have like a clear answer to them. Like there is no mechanism to resolve the pressure at that particular point. Like there are heuristics that can help and stuff like this, but I think very often it's just important to have someone who will listen to you through the irrationality until you calm down and get a grip of yourself, if that makes sense. I really don't like the approach of people who are dismissive towards investment in debating that can sometimes lead to anxiety or self-doubt and stuff like that. People who are like, why do you worry, it's just a game, or we're just supposed to enjoy this and stuff like that. I mean, yeah, but if you invest so many years and so much time and so much effort and money into an activity, you're obviously invested. Like if I wasn't invested in this, I would be in something else. So I don't need someone to tell me, you're putting too much emotion into this, because I will still put in the emotion and be angry at you. I need someone who will listen and be supportive and lead the conversation on my terms, if that makes sense. I think a support structure is very important. I think secondly, if we are talking about expectations that come from success, it's very important to remind yourself of your previous successes and that they don't come accidentally. You can accidentally win a round. You can maybe even have a tournament where all the motion set goes your way and maybe accidentally win a tournament. But if you've broken consistently, if you've gotten good speaks consistently, this obviously shows a pattern with different judges in different rooms. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got from Olja, my best friend, when I was having like trouble before Worlds in 2019. There was like Oxbridge, and I was in a new team like Luka Petrovic and I. We debated that period together, and I was having trouble adapting to the new team and stuff like this, and our results weren't that good. And what she told me was, dude, you need to watch some of your previous speeches, right? Just load your own outround speeches and listen to them and remind yourself you're actually good and you have pulled off, much more major achievements than what you're worrying about now. And this helped me put things into perspective. So I think it's also reminding yourself of the skills that you have. And lastly, a mechanism that really helped me is trying to divest the pressure that comes from an important round, like out round or round 9 or whatever, from what is actually happening in the round. Because I realized when I would rewatch debates later, debates in which I was stressed and did worse because I was stressed, I realized like if this were to happen in a random online spar, I would have no trouble coming up with a good case and winning the room, because I would not be stressed at all. I would listen to the round in a focused way. I would just, do my thing and win. But here I was 3 speaks worse because I was not listening to the room, because I was thinking about what the room means and what the significance of the room means. And for me, just a very useful heuristic was to tell myself, just imagine this is a spar and do what you would do if you were sparring, at 5 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon. And that's something that maybe it's very specific and very niche. But it's something that's helped me overcome a lot of stressful situations.
Yeah, this is something that I definitely relate to. I think it it's interesting. So in certain situations, obviously, I love how Milos put it uh, when we had this conversation, which is you kind of need to use the adrenaline and ride the wave in certain cases because it helps you be more emotional and things like that. But there are also certain situations where you need to pull back. And this is something that So for people that maybe have watched like out rounds of the most recent worlds, what you see me doing is before every speech, I take a deep breath. I do this. I'm very zen, and my mentality through that was very connected to exactly what you're saying, which is just do a good debate. Don't be too flashy. Don't be too invested emotionally within what's happening. Just try to do a very okay speech, because usually you don't need to be exceptional in out rounds, especially if you're going for just securing a second, making a good case. Let others be the ones who are worrying. Let others be the ones who are making more crucial mistakes. You just do the more important stuff that needs to be said, needs to be done. Focus on doing those things, and it did help me a lot with performing, especially octals and quarters. I would say that was very important. I don't think it was specifically exception in those rounds. I don't think they were one of my best pitches at all, but I did manage to kind of keep a certain level of composure that was needed to get the job done, if that makes sense. Um, so what are some kind of non-debate things that you go to uh, when you are looking for inspirations as a competitor?
Okay, so if we're talking about inspiration, um, I think for me, a very big source of inspiration was always football, because I'm a very big football fan and a very big Dynamo fan, the scarves and all of that. And I very often take an inspiration from sporting stories that I've like translated to my own debating career. So for me, it was very meaningful, even though it seems like random. When Lover and I made the final of Cape Town in 2019 Worlds, back then we were not, that well known as a team, and we didn't even expect to make it to like quarters, let alone finals. It was very meaningful for us that literally that same summer, the same thing happened to the Croatia national football team when we made finals at the World Cup in Russia. It was pretty much the same story. Like they were a good team, but nobody expected them to make the finals. And we consistently drew inspiration from that tournament, like including, fan songs and stuff like that, because we kind of likened ourselves to that situation. Like if they can do it, we can do it. And that's why for me, sports has very often been a very big inspiration, especially underdog stories. Because I think kind of when you come from an ESL institution, you can be very talented, but there's a bunch of hurdles that you have. Like you don't have the money, that your faculty will not pay for your all your trips abroad. You don't have like Oxford Union, Slavoj Žižek coming on Friday to give a talk in the union chamber. You don't have the money to pay coaches. You just don't have the infrastructure. You don't have more than one room to do debating, like all those kinds of things. And then with this come the limitations of being ESL, perhaps coming from a less known institution that doesn't have a name rep. And then having underdog stories you can look up to in other areas of life is very important. For me, this has always been, Dinamo Zagreb, for example. Like we're a good team, like regionally, but we're not globally famous or anything. But like if Dinamo can beat Chelsea or if Dinamo can beat Tottenham, then why shouldn't I be able to, beat Oxford and Cambridge or Harvard? And I think this has been a very, very big source of motivation for me, especially during the time where we were still not a well-known institution and still, building our way slowly through the ranks and stuff like that.
So let's talk a little bit about Cape Town. Um, did you have any major achievements before that? What were your expectations going into that particular Worlds?
Okay, so it's a very interesting junction because I started BP. Okay, my first BP tournament was in 2014, but I've only really started doing it in like spring 2016. And my first two majors were a disaster. So I didn't break at Warsaw, although we were close to breaking ESL. Then in Tallinn, I was on 14 points at EUDC. I hadn't done a Worlds up to that point, and I was actually very close to quitting debating. I was like, I'm gonna give one final shout at this with Lovro, who was a new partner at that time, and if it doesn't work, I'm just gonna quit. And then my first major break was at Novi Sad Euros, but we broke very deep. We made it to open semis, and we lost the ESL final on a split. And then we were like, okay, we're obviously talented and have potential, but we still don't know to what extent. So at Oxford and Cambridge, the goal was to break open. We did at Cambridge, didn't at Oxford. And that was kind of the goal at Worlds. We wanted to break open and we wanted to make it past the pre-octos. So getting to octo final was, I think, the realistic goal. I was silently hoping to make quarters, but we never expected to get even close to the final. At least me personally, if Lovro did, he never told me, but I never expected to make it to the final at that point.
So, how did it feel when? What was the moment when you were like, "Oh shit, this is actually happening"? Was it quarters to semis? Was it going to the quarters itself? When was the moment that you feel like, okay, we can go all the way?
I think it was after we went through quarters, because I don't know why, but I've always seen quarters and semis as being the cutoff point between you're very good and you're exceptional. And when we went through that room, in that room, we had Harvard B. That was John Hunt and Sofia Caldera, who were supposed to be one of the favorites to win alongside the Sydney teams. And that was the period where, and this only ended in 2020 with Oxford. That was a period where, like, for like 7 or 8 years, only Harvard and Sydney were winning. And when we took out Harvard, being the only team to go through that room unanimously, I was like, okay, so we're not just here to take seconds, we can beat very, very good teams. I think that was when I started to believe that we can go all the way. Although when I heard the motion for the semis, it was like heavy finance motion, something about narrow banking. My heart sank. I was like, okay, and now I'm gonna embarrass myself in front of an entire room. I went outside looking, white as death. And Lovro just lights a cigarette. He looks at me and he's like, dude, why are you worried? I have a case. And I was like, okay, fine. And then we ended up having a very good case and going through. But I think, yeah, it was after the quarters that I started believing that we can go all the way.
So I have to address the elephant in the room. Tell me about that final. Uh, what was the experience? Obviously, maybe not many people remember or are aware of, especially newer debaters. But there were some heavy controversy at Cape Town Worlds, with obviously uh, the finals happening in a interesting venue of choice. But I'll let you tell the story from your own perspective.
Yeah, so I mean, for people who don't know, I'm going to try to relay the story in a way that doesn't make presumptions about events that happened, because there's quite a bit of things where I'm unsure what actually happened, because there are different stories going around and different interpretations. But the issue was that there was a large concern about racism at the tournament, and it all boiled over when the tab director of the tournament made a comment towards a judge which was perceived to have been racist, and then this led to a long-term crisis, and up until the end of the tournament, culminating in the final day where there was supposed to be an apology made um, by the by the organizer of the tournament and or the CA team. There are different versions and accounts I've heard where, due to there not being a conclusion reached between most of the African caucus and those involved in the apology, there was a protest. I will not make assumptions as to certain specific events that happened or how people reacted or what they said or did, because I only heard all these stories from other people, and different people have different accounts of what happened. So I really don't want to make assumptions. For me, when the protest happened, it was a very weird experience, because as the ESL final was concluding, all the 4 teams in the final were taken to a room backstage where we would be given the motion, as is normal in finals, that teams get the motion apart from everybody else. And we were supposed to prep there and be led into the room for the final. And then, as prep time was coming to an end, we were just taken away from the main room, deeper into the building. And it was just confusing because we didn't know what was happening. And then we were told there's a protest going on. And we weren't told what the protest was about. We weren't given context. So the only bits of information we were getting were from people outside who were in the room. Like, Milos was texting us like this and this is happening and stuff like that. It was a very bizarre experience. And then the question was, does the CA team wait for the situation to be resolved, or do they have a backroom final? And they decided to have a backroom final, which then happened in a boiler room somewhere in the depths of that convention center in Cape Town. And then they ended up announcing the results of all 3 finals as well as speaker awards on Facebook. There was never an award ceremony because there was never a conclusion reached regarding the events that ended up sparking the protest. For me, it was like I was always conflicted as to how to feel about that. In terms of personally, I really regret not getting to speak in front of a large audience in a Worlds final, especially because in Cape Town, this was the first time that an ESL team ever made the final. And there was supposed to be a huge amount of support for us in that final, especially from ESL institutions. And I wanted to experience that as the reward for having gotten there. Because when it came to the final, I wasn't at all stressed about winning it because I never even imagined I would be in a Worlds final. I just wanted to enjoy the final. And then not getting to enjoy that is a big regret for me, especially because when we won Korea, that was online. So I was in two Worlds finals and never actually got to speak in front of a crowd. Euros, yes, but I think Worlds is a different experience. But on the other hand, I'm like, okay, if I have to trade off speaking in front of an audience to get the opportunity to be in two Worlds finals, then fine. I was never unsure if it was okay to feel regret at not having that opportunity, but I would have liked it to have happened if it were possible.
So how was the vibe in that finals room?
It was odd. Like obviously everybody was trying to win, but everybody was also very stressed, very confused as to what's going on, very confused as to what's going to happen later. And this was obvious with both us and the judges. And I think a lot of the reasons why I find that debate, like in terms of objective quality, to be underwhelming was because nobody could really get in the mood. Like you're debating, all fully dressed up with paraphernalia, from your country or institution, your flag and everything is ready. But you're doing this in some random boiler room as if it's a spar that you're doing because you're bored and stuff like that. And just can't imagine that this is the world's final. And then the entire day after that was just surreal for me. No awards announcement, coming back to the accommodation, learning that the CA team has just, or at least members have just abandoned the competition altogether and left for a hotel or something. People discussing what's going on, different stories circulating. It was a very, very surreal experience.
So how did that feel, and what role did it play in you continuing your debate journey, trying to come back to the finals?
So for me, it didn't really feel bad for long because we, came back to Croatia the next day and we had like a bunch of people waiting for us at the airport. It was a very nice, homecoming. And when it sank in that we made Worlds finals, like despite not getting to speak in the final, it was a very, very, very huge thing for me. I think what sparked my desire to return to try to win was not that event. I think it came later because Lovre and I were supposed to have our last tournament at Athens UDC. And we did very well there. We won ESL. We went to the final. And then I was like, okay, I want to do another Worlds for fun with Luca because we were high school teammates and we never did a major together in BP. And I just wanted to see how it panned out. And I think at that tournament, when we went out in quarters on a op heavy econ motion as CG, and we almost went through, like there was a 1 hour discussion where Ayala, I think, was pushing for us to go through. And I was like, I kind of feel I can do this. And that was the point where I said, I want to go back for another major and I want to do it with Lovra because I felt in 2020, I was a lot better debater than I was in 2019. And the results show that, like in terms of the speaker tab, in terms of the team tab. And I wanted another go. And I think that because Lovre was judging at that tournament. And I think he kind of had the same feel, like not getting to debate, but watching the debates and being like, I think we can do this. And we were like, okay, let's have another run at Korea. So I think it was at Thailand that I realized I want to come back to try win, not necessarily after Cape Town.
So tell me more about that year when you won Worlds. How did, obviously that was like a kind of COVID era, a bunch of stuff were happening online. How did you prepare for that competition? What are some highlights from the build up before the competition? Did you do many tournaments or did you opt out of that and mostly focused on prepping and kind of other stuff?
We had different approaches. So Lovro didn't really do prep comps. I did a bunch, like almost every weekend, and always with different speakers. So I spoke with a bunch of people who I really, really admire during that period, like for Aditya Dar, for example, or Reese Steele. Earlier in the year, I spoke with Matt Hazel. So I spoke with Rishti, a bunch of really, really good debaters who I liked speaking with. I think in terms of the build-up, again, it's this weird football connection that always exists for me in debating. Like just before that, there was the 2021 Euro because it was, how do you say, postponed because of Corona. And of course, it was this entire, fan hype and build-up, and every night you're going out to watch the games and stuff like this. And this kind of got me in the mood for my own big competition, to happen. So I was quite hyped as World was coming up.
So you get to Worlds. It's online Worlds. You did absolutely great in the in rounds. I mean, also the out rounds, but I want to talk a little bit about that. At that point, did you have any like rivalries? I know that you kind of had a bunch of debates with Ateneo teams in the in rounds. What were some things that kind of pushed you into being as competitive as possible, apart from wanting to win it all?
I think it was, for me, honestly, primarily the idea of winning. There was the rivalry with Ateneo, but it was always a friendly rivalry. Like we just enjoyed debating against them, and I hope they did enjoy debating against us. And those were very good debates. We met each other in every room, I think, from round 5 to round 9, and then again twice, I think, in the out rounds. But it was just, your eyes are set on the goal, and you want to achieve this goal. But I think what kept me sane throughout that, and what kept my goal of winning being healthy, as opposed to becoming, too obsessive or too stressful or too anxiety inducing for me, was that we had the opportunity, luckily, even though it was COVID times, to have a large, social life outside of the tournament, because cafes in Croatia at that time were open. It was like pretty much as if there was no COVID. And a couple of friends from the international community were over in Croatia. So Claudia was here, Eva Marie was here, and every night after the tournament, there were only 2 rounds. There was a bunch of time to hang out. We would go to a different bar, just talk and spend the night, go drinking somewhere. So there was this element of actually getting to enjoy the social aspect of a tournament, apart from just debating online. And I think for me, that's what made the tournament special, and what made my wanting to win be coupled with a positive vibe, as opposed to just ruminating in my room about a speech I didn't do well, or worrying about what's going to happen tomorrow, because there was the social element to distract me. And I think that was very, very important, as opposed to perhaps some other people in different areas of the world who did not have that opportunity. Because for me, the worst part of online debating was always, when the tournament finishes, when the day finishes. So what you do now? So you press exit, and what? Like there's no closure to the day. Whereas at Worlds, we had the opportunity to have that closure, and I think that really helped.
Speaking of debaters that you enjoy, um, what are some debaters that you don't enjoy debating against?
So I think I always had trouble. I wouldn't say necessarily trouble, but I never really enjoyed, in terms of my chances to win, debating against the top 2 Ateneo teams. Although we do have, I think, a positive score against them, I think they were always the team that was able to, this Romans category of goat scammers. I think in terms of that, they were always very, very good, like able to pick out one line that you said and do something along the lines of this, but with XYZ frame, or this, but in the developing world, and get away with that because they made it sound so persuasive. And I think that was something that was an amazing skill to have, and we struggled with it. So I think it was always the teams that could do that to us. I think earlier in the day, Tudor and Srishti were incredibly good at that. Just being so rhetorically persuasive that they were able to take a small piece of content you didn't cover and turn it into what many judges had to be a debate winning case. And I think those are the situations I enjoyed the least, because those are the situations I felt powerless against the most. And those are obviously all debaters I incredibly admire, and that's a fantastic skill to have. But it would be very frustrating in debating sometimes.
So you make it to the finals. You're in the finals again. What was going through your head at that particular moment? Obviously, the expectations at that point were much, much higher. You were probably uh, wondering whether you're the best speaker in the world. You had broken first. You had done very well, but you've also been there before. So, what was going through your head?
So for me personally, a lot of the pressure was lifted when we made the final, because to some extent you're aware that the final is the roll of a dice, and that it really depends on this one motion and this one position you draw. And perhaps, maybe even quite likely, if we hadn't drawn OO, and if some other team was lucky to draw OO as we did, maybe they would have been world champions. And you know that the finals of world is very random. So a lot of the pressure was lifted from my shoulders when we made finals, and I just wanted to enjoy doing that finals with Lover, like our last competitive debate ever. Especially because that was in fact the only debate during Corona that we debated from the same space. Because when we started doing debates back together at the very start of COVID, of course you could not go visit your friend in their house because there were restrictions, and we just did very well online. So we never transitioned to doing online debating together in the same room. We're always in our own rooms, in our own houses. And that final was the only debate we ever debated from the same place during Corona, during the online era. And I just wanted to enjoy that experience. So for me, finals day was perhaps, of course, apart from waiting for the results, that has to be stressful and it's incredibly, nerve wracking. But I think finals day was one of the least stressful days of Worlds for me, because we came to the final again. We did what we could with, our skills and adaptability up to that. And then we were like, okay, it's in God's hands now. If God gives us OO, we'll probably win. But, we have to see. We have to see what happens.
Was there a exciting moment when you did get O?
Yes, yes. I was very happy. I was like, yeah. Because, especially because most finals motions just tend to be wacky ideas. And then getting to be the first team to say, this idea is very wacky, tends to be a strategic advantage in those kind of situations.
So, do you think it's more because of that, or is the game broken in terms of always heavily favored to win in very close debates with very good debaters?
I don't necessarily think so. I think there's a bunch of arguments to be made for other positions. I think OG is probably the best position to be in if you want to go through an out round. I think closing opposition gives you the chance to have 15 minutes of prep and come up with a lot of very detailed content that OO can't come up with. I think OO gets favored in finals, not because OO is a broken position, but because the way finals motions are created is such that they are always something more innovative or something you didn't see before or something with a twist. And then it's always easy as OO to just do the intuition check of, guys, that's just a weird idea. But for most in-round motions that are, I would say, more down to earth with clashes, it's not necessarily the same thing.
Do you think it should be like that in terms of having the wackier motions in finals, or like motions which are more, let's say, eccentric, that kind of gather the crowd, are attention grabbers, or it should be just about may the best man win?
I mean, I'm kind of conflicted there because I think in-person debating, it's really important to have a attention grabber in a final, because that's the theatrical element of debating. There's the big stage and presumably the 8 best speakers in the world and a bunch of people gather to see what they have to say, and then you give them a boring motion about housing, and that's just a letdown. I can see the need to have very good and intelligent people speak about very wacky ideas, but of course also as a competitor, I want the motion to be balanced. So I think, this is a very boring answer, but obviously you need to strive to balance the two things out, right? Don't set an eccentric motion just because it's fun, but it's actually stupid, but also don't set a round one in a final. And it's up to CA teams to be able to balance those things out. And I think a couple of motions across the years were really, really able to do that. I think the Novi Sad ESL final motion on Collective Guild was a really good final. I think the Athens ESL final on the defining decade was a really good final motion. I think, especially in the context of late 2020, the Thailand World with Hong Kong and universal suffrage, this also China would grant universal suffrage to Hong Kong, also a very good final. So there have been numerous motions that were able to achieve this balance between being very interesting, but also being very balanced and allowing teams a fair chance to compete.
Fair enough. So you obviously like I think like especially for me, the most stressful part of any competition was when you are in the finals and not during the finals, not before the finals, but the time after the finals and between the finals and the uh, announcement ceremony, waiting for the results. Because I'm a very impatient person. You mentioned that you felt similar way. It was kind of stressful whether you're gonna get it. This I think increases especially when you feel like you had a good chance to win it, because most of the time you kind of know you have a certain expectation based on the round. So, how did it feel when you finally won it? Uh, was it a burden that you felt kind of coming off your chest, or did you think about other things?
It was mostly relief. It was I think one of my first thoughts was, okay, I did what I wanted to do in this game. I did, and I kind of felt a sense of maybe justice, that after all the effort was put in and after we closely missed out on two open finals before, that in our last debate ever together, like there was this almost cinematic level of happy ending, and I felt it was kind of fair. Of course, you always feel that way about yourself because you know your personal story and you don't know other people's personal stories. But for me, I think it was a feeling of we got justly rewarded for the effort we put in, and it was a feeling of relief that now there are no more expectations to fulfill. Like the very, very, very nice liberating feeling of I don't have to come back to Worlds ever again, and I don't want to. There's no reason to. Like I've did what I wanted to do, and now I can enjoy debating as an activity.
So, did that appreciation of the moment evolve? Because obviously, like once you've had some time to think about this whole process of getting there, finally the result, did you gain a different perspective of what was truly important about winning, or just like doing well or whatever, or do you still feel like it's a great feeling to have? Maybe I'm asking this question for myself, of putting the pressure out of your system.
I think over time I've grown to just be very grateful of that experience because not only is it a very nice memory, it's also something that's allowed me to do debating for mostly my own enjoyment. Go to tournaments only with people I want to do them with, apart from Prem and Zagreb kids because that's what the coach is supposed to do. Uh, Going only to tournaments I want to go to, that have a good crew or that are in a nice city and stuff like that, and enjoying debating and still being competitive. But there's nothing I'm preparing for, nothing I have to measure myself against, nothing that I'm anticipating as the one big thing where I have to perform. So I think in terms of getting a different perspective, I think it's mostly gratitude that I had the opportunity to fulfill my expectations, which I understand is arbitrary. And I think I remember David talking about that as well when he was talking about the GOAT. And then he said, like, obviously you don't need to, have the Champions Trophy to be the GOAT because there's so many arbitrary things. And that's true. Like, there were so many nuances in terms of, who is judging you or which position you drew, or maybe the motion just hit something you read about yesterday. So many opportunity situations where we could have gone out and somebody else could have won it. So I realized that there were many teams who are also exceptional and didn't get that opportunity. And perhaps because of the roll of a dice, perhaps because luck just didn't favor them, not because they didn't deserve that in terms of quality. So I think over time I just developed a sense of gratitude for having that chance and for the way it impacted my future engagement with debating.
I think I think I would agree with you and it's important to be grateful of that experience. I think one of the things that helped me get through the difficult moments in my debating journey was exactly the fact that I felt like once we achieve certain types of things, even if we don't go all the way out, uh, we will definitely cherish the memories of those moments. And I definitely agree that this is something that I do now and will continue to do even more once I get a better perspective or a perspective in terms of time. So, speaking of it allowed you to do other stuff, I want to ask the question of so I've noticed that you do a lot of coaching now, and you care about obviously Zagreb, and you're passionate about um, continuing the Zagreb legacy. Obviously, some of it is because many of the Zagreb people are your friends, but do you enjoy coaching be- as coaching in its own, or is it more you enjoy helping Zagreb be better?
So I think for me currently, it's mostly the joy I get out of helping the people who I care about. Because coaching is not an easy thing to do, because it's not just about transmitting skills, which is a fun activity. And it feels nice when you teach something to someone and then you see them apply that and it works for them, and you're happy about the part you had in their growth, and especially when you see them enjoying their successes and their growth, and that's very rewarding. But most of it is tiring, planning sessions week in week out, giving people optional homework to do, then you have to grade it, and then they're late with it or they don't send it, and then you get a bit angry at them, which is what I tell them every week. uh, or just having to spend the evening talking about debating when you'd maybe rather be doing something else. But for me, it's worth it as long as I think there's something behind that. And when it comes to Zagreb, it's just helping the institution grow. Firstly, helping my friends who I really cherish and appreciate and want them to have a good experience in debating. But secondly, preventing the situation that happened to me and Lover when we were starting, that we basically had no institution. Like there was a guy who would like set up training debates, and then he would judge them or get somebody from Belgrade most often to judge them. But like we got no real training, nobody to really teach us, no real institution or support structure or anything. And I just wanted to build an environment where that would no longer be true, when people would have somebody to teach them debating, somebody to turn to, somebody to ask for advice, but also a close knit community that they would enjoy spending time in. So that it's not just two teams who are competitive and traveling the world and doing tournaments, but that there's 15 or 20 people who are friends with each other, who go for drinks and have fun. This is why we always make a point, like after every training session, there is post debate drinks. And this is like a tradition you don't violate, because it's supposed to be about ending the night hanging out with your own people. So coaching is rewarding, most of the time tiring as well, especially because for me, it's not just that I coach Zagreb, it's also that I work. I'm currently at Leaders Academy coaching kids, and when you coach a lot during the week, it drains you out. Even though I enjoy coaching at Leaders also as well, the kids there are fantastic, and the entire academy is fantastic, and I really enjoy my time there. But it's tiring. However, the feeling of getting bonded with the people you're coaching and helping them is the primary motivation for me.
So one of the things that I've noticed about Zagreb is if you face many Zagreb teams, which I've had the pleasure of, you notice some similarities in certain rounds, in certain cases. And there are pretty good cases, but it becomes a kind of a meme of the state power principle, etc., etc. So I want to ask the question: uh, do you think you have invented some type of arguments that are being used right now in debating?
So the state power principle, at least in its current form, the first time I've heard it done was me and Lovro in the World's quarterfinal in 2019. That was, I hadn't heard that argument done with that structure before. It's quite possible that someone did it. It's quite possible that someone did the same thing, albeit with different phrasing. I think that's where that argument started off, at least in its current form. I think also an argument I've heard run very often in phrasing similar to the one we used is the argument of the duty of a social movement towards its members. The argument that a social movement has a ventriloquist relationship with its members because, as a social movement, you aggregate a lot of preferences and therefore you take away individual agency of people to represent themselves, which bestows some kind of duty upon the movement. And then you can twist this argument based on the motion. I've heard that done a bunch of times after Lovre and I ran this in the LSE 2021 finals. But I think maybe a bigger impact that I think I might have had, at least in terms of some of the phrases I've heard being used, is with workshops I would deliver. Because I began hearing things like, path to victory very often, or multiple paths to victory and stuff like that. And I think these might be some terms that I might have introduced to the wider community. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think it might be.
No, no, this question was very much intended. In the sense that I agree with you. So, talking about legacy, what do you want to be your debating legacy once you get out of debating? Are you going to absolutely retire of it from it at a certain point, or are you always going to be popping here and there in competitions? How do you feel about that?
I don't really think I'll ever fully retire. I think I'll probably do the Harish thing and, come to Worlds for a vacation for New Year's or go to a comp to meet my friends. I think when you're hooked to that extent, when you also do coaching, I've been in this activity since 2011. I think you never really get completely hooked off. But I think in terms of legacy, primarily, I care more about my coaching legacy than my debating legacy at this point. I would like to be remembered as someone who put in an important piece in building the institution that is Zagreb. I think in terms of my debating, I think I want to be remembered primarily in the context of having been an ESL trailblazer. I think that's probably the biggest part of my legacy that I care about, because I feel very happy to have been part of a time in debating where I think ESL institutions have really, really made a big, 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 move on the world stage, as opposed to native speaker institutions where you have Tel Aviv in the world's final and Sofia in the world's finals and Belgrade in the world's finals and Zagreb winning, and ESL teams from other continents as well having incredible performances, at worlds and their regionals and stuff like that. And that didn't used to be that way before. And I think I want to be remembered as a part of that, as part of the era when ESL institutions became really competitive with open institutions, and when they show that they can even win at the biggest stage. And of course, there's this personal element of having won worlds and having been best speaker, and that's part of what I want people to remember me for. Like, this guy was really good, but I think that's the less important part as opposed to the other things I mentioned.
So speaking of you wanting to be remembered for your coaching, so little birdie told me that you took some inspiration from Gordon Ramsay. If I have heard correctly, can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so that's one of the sources of inspiration. But I think with Gordon Ramsay in particular, it's just about watching the way he approaches teaching when it comes to skills. I'm a big fan of Kitchen Nightmares, and that's a very funny show. But I think there's a lot to be learned there in terms of pedagogy, in terms of knowing how to react to different situations, the way you change your approach towards people based on how they react to you, but also the teaching, which is not just about teaching the outcome, but also teaching the logic behind what you're doing. Because remember in many shows, like when he would train young chefs, and then they would be like, I really liked working with Chef Ramsay because he explained to me, the science behind this cooking. He taught me why, when I put this ingredient, it makes that reaction with the food and stuff like that. And I want to do the same thing in debating. I want my debaters not just to learn the argument that's going to make them win, but to understand the logic behind that argument and why that argument is winning. And this is why Gordon Ramsay in particular, but it's also a bunch of football coaches as well. I really developed a habit of listening to football podcasts or reading football analysis. There are certain football coaches I look up to in terms of their style of play. And I think a lot of coaching philosophy in football can be applied to debating as well, because it comes down to the same thing in the end, right? Both in terms of teaching the skills, but also in terms of the psychology, the man management you have to do, the building a community. I think a lot of these things are analogous, and a lot of those things can be, applied to debating as well.
Yeah, I think after this episode, we might have a different perspective on when we talk about let him cook, as as David Africa put it very, very, very well. So let's get to the interesting part of this episode, which is obviously the segment of greatest debaters of all time. How do you approach this conversation? And of course, who is the greatest debater of all time?
Okay, so in terms of approaching the conversation, I think that there cannot be one definitive answer. I think probably everyone has one answer in their heads, but they're all based on different subjective criteria. And given that debating has evolved through different types of meta, different types of expectations, the debating also depends on literally the situation in the world at the time. Some arguments are more persuasive in some years of human history, literally. Some debaters never got to compete against each other, even if the meta was the same. There's a bunch of factors that influence that. So I think objectively, there is no one true answer. There are answers I would, for example, vehemently disagree with, but I could see a reason why somebody else would have that answer. But that being said, in terms of my answer, which might come out as a bit of a rehash, but it's a very, very straightforward, honest answer, for me, it's hands down Dan Lahab. I think the reason for this is not just that Dan was objectively a very good speaker, like, incredibly adept at managing different strategic situations, and always being able to pull out a case out of nowhere, regardless of the motion and stuff like that. But I think it's also, when we approach the GOAT conversation, we need to approach it within the context in which this debater had to, exist and compete, and the barriers they perhaps had to face and the challenges. So it's not just about Dan being a very good debater in a vacuum. I think it's about the time when Dan and Ayal did what they did, breaking top at Worlds, Dan top speaking, but not just that. Also, when they won the HWS round robin, which had a very stacked pool at that time. I think the context back then was there really wasn't a slew of ESL institutions like today that would create the perception that ESL teams can compete at the same level. And I think anti-ESL bias was a lot more intense at that time, because there was simultaneously a big concentration of North American and Iona institutions who are doing really well, who are expected to perform really well. And there was the occasional ESL team making a breakthrough, but they were never expected to be at the level that they could consistently be the top teams and consistently produce those results. And that was something that they had to struggle with in that context. And I think the fact that they became trailblazers for later ESL teams who are literally standing on the shoulders of giants in that sense, because people before us made a name for ESL, as something that is relevant in debating is incredibly important. Because as far as I know, I'm sorry if I'm wrong, maybe I'm missing someone, but to my knowledge, their Worlds in Mexico was only the second time in World's history that an ESL team had such a big breakthrough on the international stage. There was Siri and Helena, who made semis in Malaysia, I think in 2015, and then there was Dan and Nayal. So the fact that they did this in that context and in that era makes it even more impressive for me. And Dan is my biggest debating inspiration ever. And earlier, when you asked me about debaters, I took two for inspiration. I didn't mention him on purpose because there would be the GOAT discussion. So I wanted to save him for then. He is definitely my biggest inspiration as a debater. And for me, hands down, always the GOAT. But I also want to say big shout out to Ayal as well, because even though I would pick Dan over Ayal, every team, in order to be that good, has to have two very good partners. And Ayal was a really, really exceptional debater, especially in his prime. So obviously, big shout out to Ayal as well.
I'm glad that you mentioned this part of the conversation. I think uh, I'm also glad that you mentioned Stefan and Helena. And I'm going to extend this segment a little bit more for my own personal liking. Who do you think are the best Balkan debaters in history?
Um, okay, so obviously I have to count myself and Lovren in that conversation. I think Siri, Helena, Milos Janko, and you and Roman. There were obviously people who came before that, whom I just don't know. But I think in terms of results, those would be eight speakers, the eight speakers I would name in that list, simply in terms of the amount of majors finals, in terms of the amount of competitions won and top speakers won and stuff like that. Of course, Belgrade was the OG institution to produce speakers on that level, and we in Zagreb are definitely a lot grateful to them because without Belgrade, we would have not been what we are, and we would not have achieved what we have achieved because they were always willing to help out, to give workshops. When they were in Croatia, they would always come and judge and give us advice in the tournaments as well. I think they helped us grow, and to some extent, they were a father institution to us. But I think today, yes, I think the eight greats from Zagreb, Sofia, and Belgrade, I would say.
Yeah, I definitely think that what we have in the Balkan debating circuit is great, especially in terms of helping each other out. Um, we like as the Bulgarians, maybe we're the newest addition to the Balkan debate history conversations, but we obviously received a bunch of help from Belgrade and from Zagreb, from Miloš, from Janko, from you, from Lovro. Um, I personally could never achieved what I've achieved without the conversation I've had with you. And we're talking about like way before I was considered good at debating in any particular level. I remember like sending you debates, asking you about stuff. Obviously doing the same with Miloš, obviously doing the same with Lovro, and having these particular conversations. Um, I have to say that from our perspective, regardless of the gold conversation, um, and like I'm gonna keep that for when I become the guest in one of these episodes somewhere in the future. But I think like this is quite important to say these particular moments of greatness that I've seen in Balkan debaters is something that has lived through, and I think it's gonna continue to live through for the future. We do carry the how do I say, the ESL spirit that was created from others before that, and I think that we are definitely huge part of obviously uh, being able to overcome the barriers that come with being ESL is something that all of us aspire to. I have to ask the spicier question. So, out of these teams, who do you think would win, and why is it me and Roman?
Well, I think most debates between those four teams would be very hotly contested, given the level of quality of those teams. And I think it's very hard to give a definitive answer because I think they're just different strengths that all of these teams have in different types of motions and different debating skills. I think if I were to give my honest answer, I think it would probably be a fight between Lovre and myself and Milos and Janko, and that's something I'm a bit sorry about, that we didn't really get to debate against each other that much, the two of our teams. Like it happened like three or four times over the years, but not very often, and I would like to have had that opportunity more often. For me, that would be the El Clasico clash, but of course I'm being subjective because when you're personally involved, you have to be to an extent. But I think that would be my answer.
So I think one part, what makes this interesting is I agree with there are differences and different strengths for different teams, but also there will be far more similarities in strategy than, let's say, the average debate, which is going to make it even more interesting because it is it is a certain type of, let's say, meta that is going to clash, which is definitely going to be interesting in these types of debates. So, I mean, you still didn't pick who would win, you and Lover or Miloš and Janko?
I will go with the partisan answer, and I will say Lovren myself. Although I know if Milos and Janko will ever be guests here, they will vehemently disagree with this statement. But that's part of the rivalry, I think, and part of the enjoyment of it.
What would potentially give you the edge against them?
I think we are better at generating content, especially in very diverse ways. Because both of us, although I do content delivery and Lovreza would be a rebuttal speaker to a larger extent, we are both very, very good at generating content in prep. And it being very diverse because of our different, how do you say, perspectives and sets of knowledge. I also think we are less stubborn. I think we are less convinced that the one idea we came up with and we think is smart is definitely the winning idea. So we're more, I think, able to see the gaps in our cases because I think we're more self-critical, perhaps. But that's just my perspective.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I definitely think that Miloš and Janko would disagree with that one, but we're gonna leave that for when they get their turn in the podcast. Um, at the end of this, I kind of give the opportunity to the guests to use the platform. So, what is something that you want to talk about? Uh, Basically, the floor is yours.
Okay, I didn't know that this question was coming, so I don't really have something in particular prepared. I guess that what I would say and what I very often say when I get the platform to speak out to a large amount of people, hopefully a large amount of people, um, is just I guess one of inspiration, which is to say there's a bunch of people out there who I've talked to over the years who perhaps come from less privileged institutions or who are trying to get good at debating but just haven't had a lot of success in the latest period and stuff like this. And I think my message would be it really pays off to keep trying and to keep working. Maybe not in a year, maybe not in two. It took me a huge amount of time to get my first major break, but at one point it will pay off because there is a level of this privilege to not being from a more affluent community, be it personally or institutionally, or to being ESL or to being a member of a minority, perhaps. But I think all of this can be overcome with just getting good at it, practicing, getting knowledge, developing your skills. And it does get better at some point. It just comes down to keeping up the hard work. And I think that would be my message to everyone who is perhaps struggling with improving in debating at this point. I'm really glad I didn't quit and that at the end I got the opportunity, maybe even being grateful to some extent that the final in 2021 was online. That was a fitting end to the story to get to win in my own city. And this would never have happened if I had quit. So this is something that I would emphasize. One last thing I would want to say, and this is completely non-inspirational and non-emotional, is I thought you would perhaps ask me the question. This is something I wanted to maybe discuss. And I wanted to mention it when we talked about the judging trends, but I felt my answer would be too long. Is this recent experiment at the HWS round robin with the no notes panels, and I'm seeing Eric publishing a lot of data that he got from this. And one of the things that really sticks out for me is that there were practically no ESL teams at that competition. Most of them were open teams, especially in the top rooms. I think there was like one ESL team or two or whatever. And most of the data that he gleans from this seems to suggest, but there's not that big of a difference between no notes and no notes. And I think for me, it's a big problem there were no ESL teams there because the entire criticism of that, the main criticism of that project was, insofar as the logic of the project was to see how persuasion works when judges are listeners as opposed to writers. There's the problem that native speakers with simply a more fluid vocabulary, with not having to simultaneously translate in their mind from their own language or having to fish for words, are just going to be more persuasive. And I think this wasn't reflected in the data at all because you mostly had open teams. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is not to diss HWS round robin, although I do have my qualms with how panels are made at that tournament and all of the stuff behind that. The reason why I'm mentioning it is because if I do have the platform, I want to highlight that even though there is definitely a large degree of respect for ESL institutions and debaters in the community, there is still an issue of ESL bias, which continues to persist. And personally, I think it's the most serious bias in debating in terms of how it affects results in particular. I'm not talking about other areas, but in terms of skewing results, maybe the most serious bias. So I want just to use the platform to highlight that this still exists as an issue and that we should still be appealing for that to be resolved and working as ORCOMs, as CA teams, as judges to resolve that issue. Because we should not be, how do you say, pacified by the fact that there are very good ESL teams right now and neglect that problem still exists. And for me, it's a very personal thing, having been an ESL speaker and continuing to be so. That's something else I wanted to mention.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly why this segment exists, because obviously I don't have epistemic access to every guest that I have on. But what do you think were some good solutions in the past, or some solutions that we can implement right now to combat these particular issues? Maybe not so much about this particular experiment. I don't think that this is ever going to become mainstream in how we adjudicate debate competitions, but in general.
So for me, I think one thing is definitely the trend of judging becoming more tracking heavy, and of this being something that's emphasized in judge briefings, in meetings with judges before the tournament, and that this is part of how judges are evaluated in feedback. I think it's also being very attentive to the feedback that teams are giving. So not dismissing a team's comment that the judge was perhaps ESL biased, but just saying, this team is salty or whatever, but looking into that concern. Of course, some concerns are illegitimate, but it's better to care about those concerns and take them seriously than to not do that. I think what's also incredibly important is to emphasize the value of EFL and ESL breaks, and to do that publicly and vocally in the community. Because I know many people, including people I love, who were in finals in the ESL and EFL category and were not satisfied with that because their perception was, nobody cares about this. And we need to combat the perception because we should care about those things. Like, yes, it's not the open final, but the reason why there's an ESL and EFL final is because we want to give a platform to teams that struggle with barriers that open teams don't struggle with. So I think combating the idea that the ESL break or the ESL final or the ESL speakers list is something that doesn't matter. It definitely does matter. And I also think one thing I would do in terms of a concrete policy, and this might be controversial, but I will say this. I want to completely abolish opting out of breaks. Because I think opting out of the open break into the ESL break is just unfair for me. Because what this means is that over 9 rounds, you have shown with different emotions and judges and positions that you're able to contend with open teams. And then by opting out, you take the spot away from the 16th team in that break, who is perhaps from an underprivileged institution, does not have the capacity or the coaching to reach the open break, but their talent should also be recognized. And that's why the ESL break is there. And I think my argument becomes even stronger, or I at least stand even more strongly behind it when it comes to opting out of the ESL into the EFL break, which I've also seen happen. And I've also seen this hurt some teams in the EFL break, who are also people who I care about. So perhaps I am emotionally invested in this. But I think we should respect the categories for what they are. They are there to give platform and representation to teams who have earned their place in that category throughout a set of rounds. And I think teams that have shown themselves to be able to compete in the higher round should take that challenge and not go glory hunt just because it's easier to reach the final perhaps for them in ESL than they can put it on their CV. This is just my personal opinion. I know a couple of people I admire and respect as people who did opt out. I just disagree with that decision. And I think for ensuring more ESL and EFL platforming, that is a policy that needs to be done away with.
100% agree with this. What I will say is, what is my personal experience on the last thing that you said. So I've only opted out of the open break once, and this was basically at me and Roman's first competition, or at least one of our first competitions, which was the Oxford IV. And we went into that competition with the concept of we were very unsure if we were going to break at all. And we were very um, nervous about that. But this was not truly reflecting our abilities at that particular moment, because obviously we managed to break open. We did fairly well at that particular tournament, and I genuinely regret it that we didn't continue in the open break, even if I know it was coming from a particular place. But I think what I want to highlight here is, if you are feeling like that and you want to opt out, obviously some people are coming from a place of insecurity, certain types of fears. I think this is legitimate, but it's more about, ask yourself how the person that didn't make the ESL break at all would feel, or didn't make the EFL break would feel. Kind of put yourself out of your particular shoes. And I think also take the challenge. Every ESL or EFL speaker that comes to these competitions, they should be going with the concept of, I want to do the best that I can do. I'm not thinking of DSL category per se. I'm not thinking of DFL category per se. Obviously, this is a great um, tool for motivation. If you know that even if you're still struggling with your language or with certain biases, you still have a platform to compete in. So this is why it's great to have the categories in itself. But if you manage to get to the open break, you should be taking that challenge. And I also want to highlight here that there are some people who just do it because they perceive it as easier path to making a final, which, let's be frank, is not really productive way to look at debating. And it's also complete bullshit in terms of making a debate final is not going to be TSL or EFL or open. It's not going to drastically improve your overall well-being in terms of I don't know, a CV point outside of debating, or even in debating in that sense. What I'm trying to say here is that these achievements should, and what they represent, should be much more reflective of how you feel about yourself, and you should be approaching these things from your own perspective. So maybe you do the open break and you get kicked out at partial double octors or the octos or quarters, and this seems like worse than being in DSL final or even winning DSL category. But in reality, it's more about you doing the best that you can as debater in that particular moment. And I don't have particular sympathy for these particular people, if I can be honest. Um, well, yeah, I think I'm glad that you brought that point up, and I think it's definitely a conversation that maybe I want to start having with more ESL and EFL speakers. But it is something to talk about in the community. Glad you brought it up. Glad that you made me believe that I should keep this segment, because obviously I cannot get every question right. So yeah, I think this is a great note to end on. Thank you for being on the podcast, for taking your time. Um, I really appreciate you for being part of our community. Our community definitely appreciates you. And good luck to everything that you have going on in your life, and obviously to Zagreb, and obviously to Dinamo Zagreb. I'm sure that they'll continue the legacy.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me.